Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Todd Buchholz.
Well, thank you, Skip, for that very kind introduction. Skip was nice enough to read everything my mother had written down, which is great. My mom is not here tonight, but my wife Debbie is here. Thank you for coming, Debbie was even willing to drive the car up from San Diego so I could read the newspaper and calculate how much we lost in the stock market yesterday. Anyway, it's great to be here at the Milken Institute, and you know you're at a well-funded institute when they serve refreshments before the event. You know, that's how you know. It's wonderful to be here with you in Santa Monica and Los Angeles. As Debbie and I were driving up, I was trying to think who were some great Los Angelinos, great people from this area. And Debbie, in fact, grew up in the Valley. And finally, we came up with some names. I actually had to Google to come up with people who were actually born here and from here. And I found out that Robert Redford was from Los Angeles. Shirley Temple was from Los Angeles. Julia Child was from Los Angeles. Jackie Robinson from Los Angeles. And George Washington was from Los Angeles. No, you're snickering. You say, no, he was from Virginia. He was from Los Angeles. In fact, he cut down that cherry tree here in Santa Monica. He did. And after he cut it down, his father turned to him and said, George, did you cut down that tree? And George said, Father, I cannot tell a lie. Yes, I cut down that tree. And his father said, well, then, George, you better pack your bags and move to Virginia, because if you can't lie, you don't have a future in California politics. All right. Oh, I like this lady up front. She just said that's a good, can we mic her? I'm going to ask a favor of you. Now, those of you at the snack counter are already fulfilling my request. I'm going to ask you all to stand up for just a moment. Please stand up for just a moment. I hear groans. Thank you. All right. I just wanted to see whether I could get a few libertarians to take orders. No. In fact, I want you now to greet your neighbor and say, hello, neighbor. I'll treat you to a free cookie after. All right. Thank you all. You may now sit down. Thank you. Oh. Yes. No. Thank you for standing up and then sitting down. And you know, I may have just saved your life. I may have just saved your life. A study in the Journal of American College of Cardiology showed that people who sit for too long have a 125% greater chance of a cardiac event than those who keep moving, those who stay active. Now think about that for a moment. Now, are you sure that you really want to get off of that treadmill? Are you sure you really want to put your legs in the lotus position, cross them, and murmur and hum and do mantras? Doesn't strike me as a very healthy attitude, in fact. So what I'm going to do this afternoon, and the time I have up here, is make an argument that we need this rushing around. That the rushing around, of course, is condemned by just about everybody. Every social psychologist, behavioral economist, every preacher and on every pulpit will condemn it. But in fact, we need it as individuals, and we need it as a society. And we are better off as a society to have all of this rushing around. Now, I have to confess to you, I didn't always believe this. And I before I get into that, I have to admit that this is a difficult time to be arguing on behalf of stress and rush. With the stock market down 5.5% yesterday, up 4.5% today, we are witnessing the most tumultuous economic era most of us have ever lived through. I mean, just a symbol of what we've seen right before our eyes. I've got some slides for you today. There we have on the left, there's our former governor. There's Arnold Schwarzenegger. There he is filling up his GM Hummer. Now, because he's still married to a Kennedy, it's a hybrid Hummer. So, you know, Arnie's getting upwards of 5-6 miles to the gallon on that baby. On the right, I've got Hot Wheels cars. And in fact, I went to Target the other day and I bought myself a new Hot Wheels car, a Pontiac GTO. Now, what is this to scale? Maybe it's 1 to 100 or 1 to 200. But do you realize in a symbol of how the world has turned upside down right before our eyes, suddenly the market capitalization, the value of all the shares of General Motors became worth less than the shares of the Hot Wheels cars. Hot Wheels could have bought GM. They didn't want to. Instead, American and Canadian taxpayers bought GM. But we never imagined we'd live in the world where there'd be such economic upheaval. So I admit that. I was speaking to a lawyer friend the other day, and I said, boy, you defend criminals, you defend people accused of all sorts of crimes. I said, would you defend anyone? Would you defend Stalin? Would you defend the concept of hell? And my friend said, well, yes, but first you can't act as if your client is Lily White. I said, well, how would you defend hell? He said, if I were defending hell, first I would admit it gets a little hot down there. The company is not always so good. All right? Well, I have to admit that this rat race and this rushing around doesn't always make us feel good, and sometimes it makes us feel bad. But the question is, what would be better? Now, I mentioned that I didn't always defend the rushing around. In fact, the opening lines of this book, the opening line is, I made a mistake. And you can ask my literary agent about this, I literally wrote a book proposal and began writing a book 5 years ago with the exact opposite point of view. I had a title, I had a subtitle, I had an outline, I had a sample chapter or two, and the title, it was going to be called Tail Hunters. How Americans are chasing success and losing their souls. And what I was arguing was that, if you look at the slide on the right, that bell curve, that there is a bell curve, and we spend so much of our time trying to be the upper end. We want to be the best looking or the smartest or the wealthiest, and we want our kids to be the best soccer players. And I was starting to despair watching soccer games on the weekends with my kids, that parents were so motivated for success that they were losing their souls and hurting their children. And I was convinced that media images were cementing this view, and it was bad for society. And then I started doing more research for the tail hunting book. And I realized that I was wrong. In fact, it doesn't matter whether we can't reach that tail. What really matters in life, in terms of trying to achieve and grasp some slivers of happiness, is not whether we win. What matters is the journey. What matters is the trying. What matters is exerting the energy and the endeavor. And it doesn't really matter in the end who has the most toys. What matters most is to be active and to be fully engaged. And if we retreat, if we try to become hermits, if we try to become recluses, we're less likely to achieve that kind of happiness and contentment. Now, I have to admit that in my career, and I've been lucky enough to work at the White House and at Harvard and some other places, and I've had lunch and dinners with billionaires, some of whom have had their faces stretched so much they look like they're re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. There's an example there. I've seen that world, and I see that it can do some damage to people, but ultimately, retreating from that and spending all of our time condemning it is not very productive either. I mean, all the condemnations, the Jeremiads that condemn us for rushing around and condemn competition, and say we gotta get rid of the competition amongst ourselves. Those, it turns out, when I look at the studies, neuroscience, psychology, economic studies, I find they're too easy to spout and too shallow to hold water. And yet I hear church ladies, and I hear social psychologists and economists, and they're all telling us that we should feel guilty about feeling competitive. Why? Well, we have as human beings, I'm convinced, this deep yearning for Eden, for paradise, this yearning, this longing to return to some simpler day. Can we build a stairway to paradise? But I got news for you. Maybe there was an Eden, depending on your religious views. Maybe there was an Eden. Maybe that's where it was according to the map, the Tigris and the Euphrates somewhere. But we can't go back. We don't have a map. We don't have an entry ticket. And human beings have evolved. Even if we could find our way back, even if the anthropologists and archaeologists got together, built a raft, crossed the Tigris and the Euphrates and found Eden, we'd probably find that some vines have overgrown. There's still that snake to deal with. And we probably wouldn't be very happy there either. During the 20th century, I'm convinced that the concept of original sin, the sort of Catholic concept of original sin, was displaced. Somehow in the 20th century, capitalism and competition became the new original sin. Capitalism, according to the church ladies and many economists and psychologists and Zen masters, capitalism and competition is the original sin that we must somehow get rid of or try to get rid of because it's corrupting us, because it's a plague on our personal lives and a plague on society. And this original sin is what does so much damage, and this is what we constantly hear. And I'll give you some example. There are journals of happiness studies. Happiness, if you just wander through any bookstore, there's a Barnes & Noble about a block from here, and you'll look at tomes and bookshelves all about happiness. And I've looked at those studies, and I'll give you some quotes from them. Daniel Gilbert's a very famous Harvard psychologist. He hosted a television series this past year. He says, happiness studies teach us that, quote, windfalls are better than pratfalls, A's are better than B's, and everything is better than a Republican administration. That's what he said the happiness studies have proved. Another happiness scholar, psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania, said, quote, I don't see how anybody could study happiness without leaning left on politics. Right? It goes beyond that. Richard Frank is a distinguished economist at Cornell University. Richard Frank has used the metaphor of trees. And here's what he says the problem with our society. He said the problem with our society is we are like trees in the forest competing against each other. We'd be much better off and much happier if we all were equal. But what happens? The oak trees grow a little taller, and they cast shade on the maple trees, and the maple trees try to catch up, and then they exceed the oaks, and then the palm trees, and before you know it, everyone is involved in this useless struggle against one another, and that's what capitalism and competition is about. The metaphor of trees. And by the way, this isn't just speculation, and this isn't just conjecture and musings and philosophizing. These psychologists and economists have real policy prescriptions that they want to put in place based on this point of view. So based on this point of view, they want to raise taxes on people above a certain income. They want to discourage the buying of certain goods that they disapprove of. They want wages determined by a national labor relations board as opposed to individual bargaining. So this isn't just musing and philosophizing. This is actually the basis of a lot of policy proposals. My question, oh, by the way, my question is this. My question doesn't come from me. Who's this individual in the middle of the slide? Who is it? Henny Youngman. Henny Youngman. How did he know? I'll explain how he knew that in a few moments. Henny Youngman, famous comedian, one of Henny Youngman's famous routines was someone asks him, how's your wife? And he says, compared to what? All right, I grant you that the system of economics that we are living in and competition can sometimes be hellish. You know, I agree, it can be frustrating. There are days it's not very fun to show up for work, but compared to what? What are the alternative kinds of system? This fellow on the left, E.F. Schumacher, some of you may remember he had a very well-known book in the 1970s called Small is Beautiful. And it basically said we need to return to kind of village precepts and village economics, smaller communities. He came up with the idea of, he called it enoughness. He said, we've got enough prosperity, we've got enough stuff. Let's just put a hold on things now and just trade among our neighbors and that'll be fine. By the way, he had a very interesting background. He was a Brit, but he was born in Germany. He was a Buddhist and tried to apply Buddhist economics to Britain. But he was also the president of, or the chairman of the British Coal Board. So here was the guy in charge of the British coal industry, but he was some sort of Buddhist monk arguing for enoughness. He came out with that book around the same time Jimmy Carter, some of you may remember in the 1970s, Jimmy Carter gave his famous Malaise speech. Remember, he wore a cardigan sweater on television like FDR. He gave a speech in front of the fire telling us, admitting that, gosh, our economic future did not look very bright, and we were running out of resources. I mean, it was such a sad, depressing speech that I think the fire went out in the middle of the speech. But that was the era of E.F. Schumacher, enoughness, enough, right? To me, there's a difference between the simple life and the life of a simpleton. That's why I've got Gilligan there, by the way. And we've got to think of things not just as headline, not just as homilies from the pulpit, but we've really got to think more deeply about what it would mean to remove competition from our society. We could have simpler days. We could go back in time. We could have a simpler time. Let's go back, scroll back the clock, 1850. Just pick a date. There was no traffic on the 5. There's no telemarketer calling you up during the dinner hour. There was no frustration because AT&T dropped your cell phone call. It was a simpler time. But was it better? Sure, we wouldn't have complained about AT&T or Verizon, but we might have complained that our children were dying of cholera. These slides here. On the upper right, that's just a cartoon that appeared in a British newspaper around that era. And basically, it just demonstrates how stinking the Thames River was at the time, because human waste just going directly into the river. You look at the Monet paintings of London. That's not just Impressionism. That was the color of the air in London during that period. Well, not very different from Los Angeles in the 1960s and 70s. The simpler life was not necessarily a better life. Life expectancy today is about 80 years of age. Do you know life expectancy on average goes up about 2 to 3 months per year? 2 to 3 months per year. In other words, a child born next year will likely live 2 months longer than a child born this year. And that's been going on for a century. As a result of this competition, as a result of this craziness we're all engaged in, life expectancy in 1900 was about 48 years of age. 48. And it's moved to 80, not because we've all held hands in the village, but because we've been actively engaged. Okay, what are the flaws in these people who want to go back to Eden? I call them Edenists. What are the flaws in their thinking? Well, first of all, again, I have to tell you, and Debbie can attest to this, I'm not one of those acquirers of a lot of material stuff. I don't own a Rolex watch. I frankly think they're too glitzy. We're probably the only family in the neighborhood that doesn't have a large screen TV, and we take a lot of heat for it from my kids. Then my brother will come over to watch a football game. My brother Scott will say, "You still watching TV on that microwave oven?" So I don't have a whole lot of sympathy with people who want to go out and jet set and buy Rolex watches, but I don't have a reason to condemn them either. My point is the flaws. Number one, every system you can think of has to have competition, will have competition. It's just what kind of competition? You think that the Soviet Union was not competitive? You think Maoist China was not competitive? Of course it was competitive. People are competitive. But it was, instead of competing to see who can build a better mousetrap or build a better iPhone or iPad or come up with a better drug to cure cancer, the competition was a zero. By the way, if that's my mom, tell her I didn't need to wear a sweater. It's not that chilly out yet. It was competition to see who could get the gulag boss to give you a cold shower once a week. There was a wonderful book, I quoted in Rush. It was called Chinese Lessons. It was by a Washington Post reporter who studied in China during the 1970s while Mao still was still in charge of things. And he talked about the competition among the students in communist China. If you applied for a scholarship, other people would try to steal your application and tear it up. So every system is going to have competition. You can't eliminate that. What you can do, though, is change society so people are competing for the remaining scraps on the table instead of competing to make life better. Second flaw, we can't go back. We can't. We can't go back to a simpler life. We can't go back to Eden. Number 3, the desire to acquire. A lot of commentators, a lot of pundits attribute this to what? To madmen, to unscrupulous advertising executives, to businessmen who want to steal our money and they trick us into buying things. That's not why we work. That's not why we acquire, because we're on this hedonic treadmill, as they call it, devised by madmen. No, we go to work and we work hard and we compete because work makes us feel better about ourselves, because work gives us validation. Nothing we prize more, really, than that attaboy, that slap on the back. I'll tell you a personal story that I mentioned at the beginning of this book. My wife and I we were just married, living in New York City. We had nice jobs and dining out most nights. And then I decided to take a job in the public sector. All right, well, that's not really the full story. It was the White House. All right, so I took a pay cut. We moved to Washington. I worked in the White House. And I had one of those offices with a fireplace, and Jack Valenti and dignitaries would come. And I was just a kid in my 20s. I didn't deserve that sort of attention. But okay, I got it. After the first week, I was miserable on that Monday morning after the first week. Why? I found out that other people, my peers, had been called in over the weekend to work, and no one had called me. And so it wasn't the power, it wasn't the money. What I desired was someone to say, hey, come on, be part of the team. Good job. And that's why we go to work, for that kind of validation, for the self-respect. Now, deep down, it's also something to do with knowing that we'll be able to provide for our children and that our genes will live on future generations. Number 4, Edinist flaw, without competition, none of us would be here today. Everybody in this room today, everyone alive today, we are the people whose foremothers and forefathers figured out how to escape the saber-toothed tigers centuries ago. We're the people, our foreparents were the folks who figured out how to escape the trampling mastodons. We're the people whose parents or grandparents or great-grandparents didn't get lost at the loading docks in Europe or in Asia or Africa, wherever we came from. Right? So all of these flaws, to me, tell me not to pay so much attention to those who tell us we need to eliminate competition from our lives. You'll often hear, well, people covet too much. People are always looking over the fence what their neighbors are up to. And of course, the Bible tells us, do not covet your neighbor's wife or your neighbor's ass or your neighbor's wife's livestock. You shouldn't covet. But think about this. What if you covet somebody's courage? Is Mandela there? Or somebody's creativity, Steve Jobs? Or somebody's patience, the Dalai Lama? Or somebody's charity or charitable impulses, Mother Teresa? So it's not so simple to condemn a lifestyle without trying to understand what it would mean if we had a different point of view. I'll tell you what it means. What is the enemy of rushing around? The enemy of rushing around is tyranny. That's the enemy of rushing around. It's Maoist re-education camps. There's our friend Fidel. Let me juxtapose Robert Frank's trees metaphor, which I started with a different trees discussion. There's a Canadian band, very popular Canadian band called Rush. Nice coincidence for me. They recorded a song a number of years ago called The Trees. And it is, they didn't think of it this way, a direct response to this distinguished economist, Robert Frank, who wrote about the trees and the useless, senseless, ridiculous competition. And here are the lyrics to their song. There's unrest in the forest. There's trouble with the trees. For the maples want more sunlight, and the oaks ignore their pleas. So the maples have formed a union and demanded equal rights. The oaks are just too greedy. We will make them give us light. Now there's no more oak oppression. For they passed a noble law, and all the trees are kept equal by hatchet, axe, and saw. How do we want to change the system, and how could you change the system in a way that would recognize we are intrinsically competitive and not somehow move to something tyrannical? There are three arguments that I want to make on behalf of Rush: neuroscience, economic history, and culture. By the way, Dick, did you ever work with Leonard Bernstein?
No, never had the opportunity.
Okay, but my friend here who gave us the answer, Henny Youngman, I mentioned that most of us don't get to be on the tail end of the bell curve. Some of you might dream someday of playing at Carnegie Hall, but I wouldn't be good enough. Some of us might dream of playing in the U.S. Open, but don't have the right forehand. Some of us might dream of singing at the Metropolitan Opera. Well, my friend Dick Fredericks, in fact, was the principal baritone for the Metropolitan Opera in New York. And he's kind enough to allow me to take singing lessons from him from time to time. So there's culture right here in our audience. All right, neuroeconomics, first argument. There are aspects of our brain that make us fit for this rat race. Two aspects I want to discuss. The first is we as human beings have this large frontal lobe, this frontal cortex. Beavers don't have that large frontal cortex. What does the frontal cortex do? It is our window to the future. It allows us to plan for the future. It allows us to imagine new futures. It allows us to innovate. I mean, that beaver might somehow map out a plan for a dam, and that's instinctual. He'll map out a plan for a dam, and he wants to accomplish it before the winter, but he can't, as we can, think, well, maybe I'll just get a flight to Palm Springs on Southwest. He can't imagine different futures, but we can. This tells me that we are fit. We have evolved in a way that we don't want stasis. We don't want to just retreat and be recluses and mantras and meditate all day. That we want to take action. We're suited for that. Number two, dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's a chemical in our brain. It makes us feel good. It's a pleasure chemical. When do we feel that surge, that rush of dopamine? We feel it when we take a chance, when we do something new, when we take a risk. It could be the teenage boy with acne getting up the nerve to ask the girl to the prom. It could be the laid-off worker deciding, you know what, I'm going to take that job even if it's got a pay cut because I gotta stay engaged. It could be an entrepreneur starting a new enterprise. We don't feel dopamine when we win. We feel dopamine when we take the risk and take the chance. This tells me that our brains are suited for an environment that urges us to do new things, not to just try to keep things even and keep things in place. I've got that elderly Frenchman down in the lower right corner. There's a fascinating study that was done recently. Researchers interviewed 60-somethings across Europe and across America. And they conducted a simple test. They asked the 60-somethings, or they cited for the 60-somethings, a variety of common items. An apple, a chair, a camera. And they asked the 60-somethings to repeat back those words. And then they waited 30 minutes or 45 minutes and asked them once again to repeat back those words. In countries where people retire early, such as France and Austria, 60-somethings cannot perform those simple mental tasks as well as they can in countries like the US and the UK and Denmark, where 60-somethings are often still in the workplace. Those French and Austrian folks think that they'll retire early, they'll spend their lives at the sidewalk cafe doing crossword puzzles, but they lose the literal ability to find that sidewalk cafe and to do that crossword puzzle. There is a risk in disengaging, and that's why early retirement, unless you stay very active, and I applaud any of you who are retired and came here because it demonstrates you're staying active and engaged, but if you don't, the IQ points just roll away. Okay, economic history. Economic history. For most, I love that cartoon with the ape or the monkey evolves into the surfer. I don't know whether that's evolution or devolution, but that's a different story. For most of human life on Earth, we have lived no better on 2 legs than we lived on 4. For most of human life, human existence, our standard of living, our ability to feed and clothe ourselves has been no better on 2 legs than on 4. Until only a couple hundred years ago, most human beings were really living at the level of animals. But something changed. We permitted 300 years ago a more competitive economic trading society, commercial society to emerge. And that's what's made the difference. Now, most writers and many commentators don't buy this. We've got you're probably familiar with the noble savage myth. This was promulgated most prominently by the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who basically said that a primitive person outside of civilization is more noble, has a bigger heart, is more honest, has more insight into the human condition than those of us in modern civilization. And we see this in so many. It's the story of Tarzan. Tarzan was a much nicer, smarter, insightful, kinder person than all of us. You see, my kids love the movie George of the Jungle, which is a modern take on Tarzan, where at one point George of the Jungle leaves the jungle and he ends up in San Francisco. And of course, he's there with a bunch of people who've been corrupted by high society. The original Tarzan was written around the same time as Oscar Wilde wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray. Think of it now, if you remember the Dorian Gray story, he was a highly cultured urbanite. But in the end, you find that his heart has been hardened and destroyed by society and civilization. Well, I reject that, and the statistics and the studies and economic history reject that point of view. When you look at Aboriginal societies, when you look at primitive societies, both through archaeological evidence as well as recent evidence of Aboriginal societies, 20 to 40% died in battle. It wasn't a more peaceful place. The murder rate in Europe is today 10% of what it was in the year 1300. So for all the kind of fantasies that there was a simpler time when people treated each other more gently, it simply isn't the case. It's a lovely fantasy, and every once in a while I'll kind of read that to my children too, but we're adults, and we have to take life as it is. What is sustainable in life, in civilization? Now I've got, look, juxtapose what we have here. Gosh, look, those people down south, they left all the lights on. Those people, they have no respect for resources. That can't be sustainable. Oh, the people on top, well, that's much better. What are you looking at? Anyone want to guess what you're looking at? My God, you're all so smart. North Korea and South Korea. Exactly. North Korea and South Korea. There's studies I can show you showing that as societies become wealthier, their environments become healthier, not less healthy. There are relationships between income and life satisfaction that all the tisk-tisk philosophers and psychologists and economists want to ignore. Ultimately, when you look at what sort of societies are well off and what are not, it's not about the latitude, it's about attitude. That's what matters most in terms of whether a society will be well off or not. You know, when I was a kid, I used to look at maps a lot. I used to think, gosh darn, the Soviet Union, they have everything. They have gold and they have silver and they've got platinum and they have bauxite, whatever the hell bauxite is. They got more of it than we do. But what did they do with it? It was just poverty everywhere. You look at Holland, was just a sunken mess, but they created prosperity. If you want entertainment, read Mark Twain's observations of Palestine, of Israel from the 1800s. He portrays it as the most desolate, God-forsaken place you could imagine. Not a sprig of parsley out of the ground. And yet Israel now, if you look, probably has, I believe the statistic says, next to the U.S., the most listed companies on the NASDAQ, technology firms, are in Israel. So it's not the latitude, it's not the earth, it's really the attitude. Ronald Reagan had said, he said, there's nothing wrong with, he said, there are only 4 things wrong with Soviet agriculture. Only 4 other, if they could fix this, it would be fine. The only 4 things wrong with Soviet agriculture are summer, winter, spring, and fall. Other than that, they're in good shape. I'm amazed as I travel the world to see countries trying to move into trade and commercialism and capitalism. I was in Vietnam last year. If you go to Vietnam, yes, you see lots of billboards of Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was the father of Vietnamese communism, as most of you recall. And there are still billboards of him, well, I was going around Vietnam, and a friend of mine, Quang, was showing me around, and finally I saw one billboard that looked a little cartoonish. So I asked my friend Quang, I said, is that one Ho Chi Minh? And my friend says, oh, no, that's Colonel Sanders, KFC. Well, he in fact was making a joke, and his joke was, we don't care about communism anymore. We don't care about that kind of attitude. We don't care about socialism. We care about trade. And we care about creating a more modern society. I had North Korea, South Korea. You can compare Turkey to Syria. You can compare the Dominican Republic to Haiti to see how you could have the exact same piece of property and just a shocking difference in the level of the standard of living. You also see how institutions treat people in competitive environments compared to environments that try to stomp on competition. On the upper left, that is a line for a supermarket in the Soviet Union before, obviously, the Berlin Wall fell down and the Soviet Union broke up and became somewhat more tradable. That's a long line. I remember visiting the Soviet Union before the wall fell. You stood in line for a long time for the right to buy a chicken leg. And then you stood in another line so some nasty woman behind the counter could tell you, here's your chicken leg. It was misery. Now, we still have that in some places here in the U.S., but it's in non-competitive places. The upper right, that's the line at the DMV. It's a non-competitive place. You have to go to the DMV. Now, we have lines in other places too. There's a line in the lower left, but that is a line to get the iPad on opening day. So when we have lines here, it's usually for something that people really want and they're delighted to get. Now, I'm not going to tell you that every private sector enterprise is run well. I'm not going to tell you that. I'm not going to tell you that capitalism only produces winners. I was meeting my wife at the theater in New York. If you look at the lower right there, meeting my wife at the theater in New York. I had a couple minutes to grab something to eat. So I ducked into the Pizza Hut. And there was a line. I got to the front of the line. Young woman, big doe eyes, looks at me apologetically and says, I'm sorry, but we ran out of pizza. Like, so what are you now, Hut? I'm not going to apologize for everyone, but largely in this country, the lines you can't stand to stand in are the lines created because of a non-competitive process. Okay, I mentioned neuroscience, I mentioned economic history. Now let me talk a little bit about culture and competitiveness. Let's start with, let's see, who do we start with? Start lower left, the yellow brick road. We as human beings, we like drama. We like some tension. For all the people telling us to meditate and take all the stress out of your lives, we somehow intrinsically are drawn to some drama, some tension, even some melodrama. Children know this. Children like The Wizard of Oz because they like finding out that the end of the yellow brick road is not just cotton candy, but there's a nasty green witch. That's what makes it fun. Fairy tales, children like. If you took out the bad characters, no child would stay awake or want to listen to a fairy tale. Look at culture. There's a Byzantine painting on the upper left. here's my honest opinion. There may be some professional art historians in the audience. I have to confess to you, I think pre-Renaissance paintings are boring. Boring. The Madonna, she looks like a Botoxed actress, from Beverly Hills. There's no sign of tension. There's no sign of real human life. Why do we admire Michelangelo so much? Because Michelangelo shows us the real human condition. That's Michelangelo's David. I didn't show you the whole thing because I wasn't sure who'd be in the audience today. But you see that. We took our daughters there to Florence this summer to see Michelangelo from all angles. Do we have to leave yet, Dad? Look at the furrowed brow. You talk about rippling muscles and tension. Look at Michelangelo's Moses. Forget Arnold Schwarzenegger and rippling muscles. Why do we prize Michelangelo above almost any other sculptor who lived? Because he shows us real human beings, not fake, de-stressed human beings. And as I said earlier, it's not the final moment, the winning, that counts. It's the story, the journey, the passage. That's what counts for us. That's why at the end of the movie Rocky, if you remember the original Rocky movie, at the very end, the bell rings, Rocky is bloodied, Apollo Creed is ruptured. Rocky yells out, "Yo, Adrian," right? And the credits roll. And unless you're paying close attention, you don't know whether Rocky won or not. If you pay close attention, you realize he lost, but you don't care that he lost, because it's not the winning and the losing. It's what he goes through. It's what we go through that count the most. Skip had mentioned Jersey Boys, which I'm delighted to be associated with in some way. At the end of that show, the Frankie Valli character steps in front of the audience, and he says, they ask you, what was the high point? Was it selling all those records? Was it the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Was it pulling the song Sherry out of the hat? He said it was all great. He said, but when it was four guys under the street lamp, when it was all in front of us, that was the sweetest moment. And that's really the sweetest moments for us, is when it's in front of us, not when we count the certificates or trophies or the winnings. Now, in terms of business, and I've only got a few more minutes to go, what happens when companies get lazy? What happens when companies try to take the competition and the stress out? That's the story of General Motors as far as I'm concerned. I happen to have in my garage, this was from my parents, an original 1956 Chevy Bel Air Convertible. All right, that's the upper left, Chevy Bel Air Convertible. General Motors was a fantastic company in the 50s and 60s. Why? Because the divisions competed against each other. Because the Pontiac on the right didn't have the same engine as the Chevrolet. It didn't look like the Chevrolet. The Pontiac dealer tried to poach customers from the Chevy lot, as did Oldsmobile and Buick and Cadillac. These were teams fighting against each other, competing against each other, and that's what made the company great. And when did the company fall apart? In the 1970s, when it became homogeneous. Those two cars there, they look identical, don't they? I'm telling you, you can look at the window, the windows, the frame, look at the wheel, around the wheels. Every aspect of that car on the left is the same as the right. One is a Buick LeSabre, the other is an Oldsmobile 88, both built in 1980. Owners of Cadillacs opened their cars, the hoods of their cars in the 1970s, and found out that they had an Oldsmobile or Pontiac engine under the hood. General Motors began falling apart when they lost the taste of competitiveness. That's when they fell apart. When the CEOs tried to take all the stress out, and ultimately General Motors ended up with a jobs bank. Do you know about that? They gave in to union demands for a jobs bank, so tens of thousands of GM workers were paid not to work on the assembly line, but to sit around and play cards all day long. Why? because GM didn't have the guts to take a strike and fire people when they weren't needed. So instead, they just paid them to play cards. And one of the most fascinating things, usually you've got stories about seniority, and in bad times, the senior workers keep their jobs and the junior workers lose their jobs, right? This turned everything upside down. The job bank, because they played cards each day, was seen as better than working on the assembly line. So when GM wanted to hire one new worker, the senior guy said, hey, I'm here playing cards. I'm not going to work. And so the junior guys ended up working on the assembly. Anyway, when you try to take the stress and the competition out, you end up driving to bankruptcy court. So I've got to close in just a moment or two. I've got some questions for those people who tell us that we need to take out the stress, we need to take out the competition, we can build a better world without it. First question. In what point in human history would you have said, enough? We've got enough prosperity. We've got enough stuff. I don't know, 1 AD? Look, Rome had plumbing, indoor plumbing and baths in 1 AD. They also had cholera and syphilis and fed people to the lions. But some people probably in 1 AD thought this was the height of civilization. How about 1954, the Eisenhower years, Ozzie and Harriet, Happy Days, Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, everything was going great. But do you realize in 1954, 10,000 children were struck with polio? How is polio cured? There's Jonas Salk by a guy who was figuratively a lab rat, what we call a lab rat. You couldn't get him out of the lab because he wanted to cure this disease and he wouldn't stop. And he was ambitious. And the same can be true of Watson and Crick, who discovered DNA. So at no point in our past, I think, would we all say, well, this is enough, we should have stopped here. Thank God Theodore Roosevelt in 1905 didn't put the economy in a lockbox and say, well, this is enough. Because life expectancy, as I said, would be 48. And as Milton Berle joked, and we'd all be watching television by candlelight. If you think that we should take all the competition out, do you really think, you have to answer this, would life expectancy have risen from 48 to 80? Before we engaged in this more competitive world a couple hundred years ago, poor people were literally shrunken compared to middle income and affluent people. They couldn't get enough nutrition. They were inches shorter because of that. Do you think if we didn't engage in this competitive world, we would have had that kind of progress? Before we had this more competitive world starting a couple hundred years ago, 40% of poor people saw their infants die at birth. Do you think we would have had that kind of progress without a more competitive world? And finally, there's the issue of freedom. In a less competitive world, in a more traditional society, people did what their parents did for a living, or what their grandparents did for a living. If your name was Smith, you were a blacksmith, and your father was a blacksmith, and his father before him was a blacksmith, you didn't have the freedom to choose what you wanted to be. I'm glad that that's no longer the case. Pope John Paul II's father was a tailor. Ronald Reagan's father was an alcoholic, failed shoe salesman. Thank God Pope John Paul and Ronald Reagan didn't follow in their father's footsteps. Right? Or the Berlin Wall might still be standing. I mean, Reagan would have been such an effective shoe salesman, we'd all be wearing hush puppies or something. But the world has changed because this competitive world has extended life, and I would argue made life better. Let me close this way. Tell you a story about a guy named Harry. Harry hears that the California State Lottery is paying $100 million. Harry goes to church on his knees. He said, God, let me win the lottery. If I win the lottery, I've been a good son. I've been a good neighbor. I'll do good things. Nothing. Next week he comes back. It's $150 million. He goes back to church. God, if you let me win, 150 million, I'll put a new wing on the school, I'll spend all of my time volunteering, I'll only do good things, I've been a good neighbor, a good son. Nothing. Next week, $250 million. Harry goes back to church on his knees. God, please let me win. There'll be a new wing on the hospital. I'll give money to the Milken Institute. I'll give money to the schools. I'll donate all of it. It will cure poverty. A booming voice from the heavens. Harry, meet me halfway. Buy a ticket. My view is, if you try to retreat, if we try to retreat from a competitive society, if we don't recognize that you need to buy a ticket, it's not about the winning, it's about the journey. If you don't buy a ticket, if you don't exert energy, if you don't demonstrate a will to live, a will to engage, then you're not going to be living a happy, meditative life. You'll be living the kind of miserable life that our ancestors did thousands and thousands of years ago. And that's not something to aspire to. That is something to shrink from. So I thank the Milken Institute so much for inviting me here today. I thank all of you for coming. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Todd. We especially like the joke about donating to the Institute. That was very good. Okay, we have 2 microphones. If you have a question, raise your hand. If you have the microphone, you can ask a question. Otherwise, please wait for the microphone.
Skip by.
Please.
And by the way, if there the events going on in the world, current events right now, if anyone wants to ask questions about whether we're going back to the dark ages given the economy, we can talk about some of these headline issues as well.
We do have an expert in the room on that. So please, just one quick question, no long statements, no follow-ups, so more people a chance to answer. So we're going to start in the back of the room here.
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. So maybe just a question, or a quick question if I could. So you gave a lot of analogies today and about the importance of being engaged and rushing and so on. So imagine that you're sitting in an airplane with your wife on your way back home, and all of a sudden you're running into thunderstorms, lightning, fog, and as you're coming into the airport, do you want your pilot full of adrenaline, rushing, he's going to really compete to get you in, or do you really want him to take his time and think, and if it's not really right, to maybe relax a little bit? So my question is, are there only 2 states of being for you, either completely rushing or completely retired? And would you afford for some sense of balance, that there are times when it's appropriate to be rushing and engaged and active, and other times when it's appropriate to maybe be more contemplative and reflective?
Certainly, I think contemplation and reflection make sense, have a place. I'll give you an example from this book, a real example, as opposed to the pilot example you just concocted. I'm only giving you a hard time because you're standing. You didn't take a seat up front. A number of years ago, I was called to Phoenix by my mother because my father had suffered a heart attack. And they live in San Diego, didn't know any doctors there. And we had a few moments to interview 2 surgeons. And it was a pretty serious cardiac situation for my father. And there were 2 surgeons, one of whom I didn't like. I didn't like him. He reminded me of some like Tom Cruise Top Gun guy. I know he was wearing scrubs, but I imagine him with a bomber jacket. But this was a guy who was focused. This was a guy who went into that operating room, I don't know, a dozen times a day, and was focused on being the best he could be. The other surgeon, I liked him. I would have loved to go to dinner with him. He was much more relaxed, much more contemplative, but he didn't see as much action on the battlefield. He didn't see as much action in the operating room. And let me tell you, when your father's going into surgery and his life is determined by some tubes that are tethering him to a gurney and by a guy with a scalpel, you want the Top Gun. I wanted the Top Gun. So Sure, there's a time for contemplation, but you know what? What I'm responding to in Rush are those bookshelves filled with people excoriating competition. The bookshelves are not filled with people saying, leave a moderate life, there is a place for rushing around. The bookshelves and the happiness studies are filled with people, as I mentioned, I quoted Dan O'Gilbert and others, who are telling us that everything that we feel in our gut about competition really needs to be stomped out if we're going to be happy. So.
Hi, thank you. Very interesting. I just wondered what you were doing in Vietnam. Vietnam is a place I lived for 4 years, so and I love very much. I just wondered what your thoughts were of how this country has come together after what we did to it.
Well, I was with my teenage daughter, and we were touring Southeast Asia, and it's remarkable how Vietnam, especially in the South, is progressing so quickly economically. And as you look back on history, they don't refer to the Vietnam War. You know, they don't even call it the war with America. It's something, I wouldn't call it a footnote in their past. It's certainly much more than that because they had so many deaths, but it is something definitely in their past. And it did make me think that if we knew then that someday Vietnam would, even if we lost the war, become more capitalist, become more friendly, it puts that war in a different light. The other thing, in terms of today's activities, Vietnam is scared to death of China. Vietnam looks to America, and this gets off the topic of Rush, but Vietnam is concerned about budget cuts for the U.S. Department of Defense. Now, isn't that a shocking irony? Vietnam would lobby before the U.S. Congress not to cut defense spending because Vietnam wants the U.S. Navy strong enough and robust enough to help protect it from China's ambitions. Yes?
Testing. I think this is working right.
That works, yeah.
Okay, Todd, thank you so much for your elucidative and intelligent, energetic presentation. In view of what's going on in the world today, vis-a-vis Sharia law, seemingly want to push Western civilization back into the 7th century. What would be your thinking on that? They're going in the opposite direction.
Societies can slide backwards. It is possible. You can explore ancient Rome, as we did, and one of our best friends is with us today. We explored ancient Rome, and then you think of the Middle Ages, where society lost a lot, Western society, lost knowledge of Aristotle and knowledge of science and so on. So societies can backslide. It happened in modern times. Looking at the first time I was in St. Petersburg, Russia, was just after the wall fell, and I realized that the problem with communism was not that Soviet Union couldn't keep up with the standards of the West as we became richer and richer in the 20th century. The problem with communism was they couldn't maintain the standard of 1917. And so Leningrad and St. Petersburg was a more polluted, worse place in 1980 than it was in 1916 or 17. So am I concerned about Sharia law? Yes. Can that concern be exaggerated? It can be. And I'll give you a simple example. There are financial institutions that are devising investments, bonds and so on, that will pay interest and pay them in a way so it doesn't violate the usury laws of the Quran. I don't care. That doesn't bother me. But in terms of a judicial system, I find it, shocking and frightening to imagine taking other aspects of a Sharia-compliant judicial system and grafting it onto society as we know it.
Okay.
Yes?
Hi, Todd. My question, I haven't read the book yet, but
Have you bought the book? That's really what's more important.
You reference in your lecture, you referenced the rat race as being synonymous with competition and with progress. I'm wondering if there's any distinctions, kind of drilling down a little bit more, like the author Kiyosaki, Rich Dad Poor Dad, and uses the rat race example more as someone on a hamster wheel that's kind of just doing the same thing over and over again. In the distinction of someone's job that's just doing the same thing over and over again versus maybe finding a deeper meaning in what you're doing and having more of an impact, a larger potentiality of what you're doing. So you're not on that hamster wheel, but you're actually. I'm wondering if you can expand on. Does it get into that?
Yes, I think that's a very fair question. Look, the metaphor rat race is not one that I love. It's kind of a symbol and a reasonable subtitle for the book, but would I be bored in honor of Lucille Ball's 100th birthday? If you went to Google a couple days ago, they were showing clips of I Love Lucy, and one of the clips is when she and Ethel are working on the chocolate factory assembly line. It's a great episode. Would I be happy with that job? No. Do I think other people are terribly happy just working widgets on an assembly line? No, I don't really think so. But I do think that the chances of moving from that to something else, job mobility, is greater than at any other time in human history. And I take the point, and I do get concerned. I often speak to young people in their 20s, and they tell me they're trapped in a job that they don't like. And by the way, these conversations would have taken place before the Great Recession. Right? So even before the Great Recession, when the unemployment rate was low, 20-somethings would tell me, I don't really like my job. And I said, well, do you have a mortgage? I said, no. Do you have kids? No. Do you have a wife? No. Or a husband? No. Then what the hell are you staying in a job? Well, I have a gym membership, and I've got seniority now because I've been there 9. I think we self-impose a lot of these steel cages around ourselves, even in good times. And so that's why part of the point of Rush is the liberation we should feel and look for, as opposed to creating these cages around ourselves, which I would admit can lead to a lot of misery. Yes, I'm sorry, this lady's been patient, and she has a microphone, and she could whap me with it.
Well, actually, your lecture could inspire hundreds of questions, but I have one, genius.
The microphone's off, I guess. Oh, it's on. Just hold it closer.
Oh, hello? Oh,
yes.
Okay. I was saying that your lecture...
She was saying how wonderful the lecture was, how you need to buy 6 books each.
No, well...
Thank you very much. Now to the back.
Okay. What is your take on... I mean, certain people are just geniuses. That's one
right.
thing. And then advance evolution in society. That's one thing. And the other is that there are certain people who have succeeded beyond all imagination, and then there are unions. And your take about what's going on in Wisconsin.
All this to get to Wisconsin. Let's just go right to education for a moment. If you can find a 7th grade algebra teacher or pre-algebra teacher who can inspire her students, who can elicit good test scores, who can get them interested in figuring out what a quadratic equation is, and she's been teaching only 4 years, shouldn't you pay her more than the gym teacher that's been there for 8 years? I think so. And if that's the case, you've got to grapple with teachers' unions who stand in the way of that. And that's just, I know of very few people who would argue on behalf of the gym teacher. I know very few parents who would. And yet that is essentially the law in almost every school district in the country. So that's my view. If you haven't seen the movie Waiting for Superman, boy, I found it poignant. I saw it on an airplane, and as if it were a horror movie, at one point I actually looked away and turned down the sound, because tears were filling my eyes to see what these poor, literally poor kids were having to live with under the name of education as a result of the systems that are in place. And by the way, from a political point of view, that movie was directed and written by the gentleman who directed and wrote Al Gore's movie, Oscar-winning documentary, An Inconvenient Truth. So it's not, right-wing pap brought to you by the Milton Friedman Foundation. It's actually someone who looked and investigated what's going on in so many school districts. By the way, I have a very high regard for Milton Friedman.
Todd, first and foremost, great presentation, and the premise of your book is refreshing after having just lived in Europe for the past 2 years and been chastised for trying to teach people to focus on profitability if they're running a business. But anyway, so I don't think your book will go over well there.
I'm getting hate mail already.
I'm sure.
Literally.
The question I have is going back to when you were saying that sometimes these societies like Rome and so forth fall, and I'm in the midst of a friendly but heated debate with a friend of mine in the administration, and I say there's no leadership in Washington. Is it naive on my part to think that rather than looking at stimulus as spending, that we could invest in education, in infrastructure, in these types of things, that we would see a return on investment here in this country? Is that naive on my part? Because if I'm wrong, I want to apologize to my friend.
Well, I think there is some naivete in that. The question is, A, where does the money come from? And B, what is it used for? I don't have the chart with me, but I could show you a graph, and I'm sure the Milken Institute can show you a graph that would demonstrate that spending per pupil across the country, despite years and years of hearing about budget cuts and so on, spending per pupil across the country has gone up by X percent. And I can't fill in the blank for you because I don't remember, maybe 3 or 6% every year since I was a kid. For the last 40 years, it's gone up at a steady pace, spending per pupil. But when you look at how that money is spent and the effects of that, we're not getting the payoff that we should be getting. My wife and I were here in L.A. over the weekend, and we were speaking with my sister-in-law, who was talking about the school system in the San Fernando Valley, and how many parents who aren't Catholic are looking to send their kids to Catholic schools because the Catholic schools are getting better results at a far less cost than either the public schools or the $25,000 super expensive private schools. So you've got to ask, how is the money being spent? A study was done by John Taylor, who's a very distinguished economist at Stanford University. And John Taylor had done a study about the stimulus spending. And what he found was when the federal government spent money on infrastructure stimulus, the money was fungible. So the states just pocketed the money and spent less themselves. So to actually get that money effectively working is much more a challenge than simply writing a bigger and bigger check.
But isn't that the whole point of leadership?
Well, it's not just leadership. It depends how you define leadership. It's actually the nuts and bolts of management. And when President Obama announced that stimulus plan, and I can go on if there's a follow-up question about the stimulus plan, maybe I will anyway, he told us we could trust it. Why? Because Joe was going to watch that money for us. Joe Biden, he says, and no one gets around Joe Biden when it comes to money. The stimulus plan, remember, was sold as shovel-ready projects, right? Shovel-ready. 2 words, shovel. Infrastructure, bridges, tunnel. Do you know what percentage actually went for infrastructure? 6.5%. 6.5. Those shovels were like teaspoons in the hands of Yao Ming. Those were and ready. That was the word. We're going to get that money out the door. Do you know how much went out in the first year? About 30%. Why? Because politicians like to string us along. I've got more money for you next year. I got midterm elections coming up. Got more money for you. The Chinese did it differently. Because I got news for you. The Chinese, they had a stimulus plan, but the Chinese Communist Party in China, they don't care about midterm elections. But they knew this: if they didn't get economic growth going, they were going to be hanged in Tiananmen Square. So they spent $600 billion, got out the door all in the first year, and immediately American manufacturers started getting orders. So leadership is one thing, but you got to combine that leadership with the threat of being hanged in Tiananmen Square, or whatever our equivalent would be, in order to actually get some real action. Let's hang him. And I'm not really seeing that in Washington today.
Todd, if you went back to the White House, but this time you went back to run the Office of Science and Technology Policy, they have a $150 billion a year budget. How would you create 10 million jobs?
Well, the first thing I would do would, actually, when I was in the White House, I gave a lecture at the White House called something like, I can't remember the third word, but two of the words were honesty and modesty in economics. So the first thing I would do is be more modest and say, I have no idea how to create an equation that would be credible, telling you 150 billion creates 10,000. I mean, that's just, nonsensical of a politician to tell you he can show you how that equation's going to work. So I try to be more modest about that. But we do need to be investing in research and development. Here's where I actually take some issue with the economists who condemn healthcare spending. You'll hear a lot of economists tell you that we used to spend 5% on healthcare, now we're spending 15% on healthcare, and it's bankrupting. And to which I say, well, what would you rather spend money on instead of, internet porn? Life expectancy, I said, has gone up. The chances of living through a cardiac event has gone up dramatically. So in many cases, I think we actually get our money's worth for health care spending. There are other avenues, and in the energy sector, if we can figure out how in the world to create clean coal, that's worth a big investment sum. Material science, I think I think the key, though, is not to be so arrogant as to think you know what the winner is, and if we just put money there, that's going to win. Because I'll tell you my experience. When I was in the White House, I was helping to run telecommunications policy, and people were saying, oh, the future is coaxial cable. Then other people, no, it's fiber optic cable. No, it's wireless. And they continually have these debates about which technology people would. The fact is no one knew which would be the winner, and there was no point. It would have been a terrible mistake to say we're going to put all the money towards fiber optic. And believe me, AT&T and Bell Labs and many others wanted us put all the money into fiber optic cables. And it would have been a bad decision. Apple at the time was arguing for wireless. Maybe that would have been better. My point is that policymakers are never smart. None of us is smart enough to figure out exactly who the winner or loser is going to be, but we can identify certain areas. And I was a big advocate at the time of prizes in order to induce companies. And actually the Obama administration has moved towards this in certain respects. And I'm a big fan of saying, if you figure out how to just fill in the blank, then you will receive X million dollars. And Google and Netflix and other private sector companies have done this in those spheres. And to me, that's about the competitive juices. And that's a good thing, and to me it fits well with this book, which you'll all be buying shortly.
We have time for one more
All
question
right.
over here. Oh, Todd, over in the... Whoever has the microphone over there.
It's the degree of competition, because my understanding is that life expectancy, my children's children, are not expected to live as long as and as well as I. Now, I could be wrong, but that's what I've been reading a lot, so I'll bow to someone who knows more.
Well, and you know what? If you flipped through Newsweek magazine in 1960, you might have read some people saying that. It turned out not to be true in 1950, and there are always people who say this is the height. There was around the time of E.F. Schumacher in Small is Beautiful, there was a very famous American biologist named Paul Ehrlich, and many of you might be familiar with his name. And Paul Ehrlich warned that by the year 2000, pollution would block 85% of the sun's rays. And that would be it for all of us, say bye-bye. Well, that turned out not to be true. So I tend to, as long as there is freedom, and as long as there are some incentives to make life better, I certainly don't see any reason why your children and grandchildren wouldn't, on average, be living well past average life expectancy in this room. And I see substantial reason to think that we could be living much longer, given better medicine, better nutrition, and other kinds of other sorts of devices. By the way, I recently heard a lecture by John Mackey, who's the CEO of Whole Foods, or as some people call it, Whole Paycheck, because it's so expensive, who gives a lecture called You Can Live to 100, which is a lecture we should take my wife's grandfather to. He's 97, and he's going to go to 107, so he'd be or 117. He'd be very upset if we told him 100's the limit. So may you all live well past whatever Whole Foods is telling you can live to. And thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you, Todd. Just a reminder, you can buy the book over here, and he will sign autographs. Thank you for coming.